Kia ora, everyone. 2008 was one of the toughest years I ever had as a pastor. In the space of 2 short months, we lost 3 precious girls in our congregation. The first in late March was a stillbirth. This wonderful family with 3 beautiful daughters lost their 4th daughter in the womb. She had to be delivered and they named her Amy Grace, and a few days later I led a funeral service for this beautiful girl. Less than a month later came a second funeral. New Zealand was gripped by the Mangatapopo tragedy, where 6 students and 1 teacher from Elam College out in East Auckland, where we are, were killed in this tragic canyoning accident. One of them was Natasha Bray. Her parents, Andy and Nikki, were a foundational leadership couple in our church. They were good friends of Rochelle and I. Natasha was one of the most vibrant, Christ-honouring teenagers I've ever met. She babysat our kids, and to lead her funeral was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And then a month later, we lost a 3rd little girl. Hannah was 5 years old, suffering from an incredibly rare brain disease. She was only the 2nd person in New Zealand to ever have it. They had to send the biopsies over to Europe to get them analysed. And she died just a few days short of her 6th birthday with a vibrant and lovely faith in Jesus. And I led my 3rd funeral on her 6th birthday. 3 girls in the space of just 8 or 9 weeks. And in that moment, that time period, not only was that incredibly hard as a pastor, but I came face to face with the reality of death in a way that I hadn't had to before. I found myself staring into the face of death. Death is not something we like to talk about. Death is not something that we bring up in conversation with polite society. But we need to talk about death more. JD reminded us in our Ecclesiastes series, Smoke and Mirrors, that death is part of life. In fact, as he finished that series up last week, he suggested that in some ways we learn to really engage in life and enjoy life when we have one foot in the grave, when we're cognizant and understanding of our mortality. And the truth is, death stalks all of us. Unless Jesus returns in our lifetime, every single one of us are going to die. The mortality rate for humanity is 100%. And so we, in the next couple of weeks, are doing this simple little series called After I Die. And I want to explore with you what the Bible teaches about the afterlife and where we're going and what heaven will be like. And today I want to ask the question, what happens after I die? In that moment after we're pronounced dead, when we close our eyes for the last time, when our heart beats its last beat, what comes next? What happens next? What happens the moment after I die? And if you were to ask people in our community and our society around us, you come up with a bunch of different answers. There are some who propose naturalism, which is the idea that actually nothing happens after we die. That's just the end. So former Deputy Prime Minister Michael Cullen passed away a couple of months ago, and this is the philosophy that he talked about in an interview with the Herald. He said he believes that death is the end and that's it. Others believe there is something after death, and they buy the idea from Eastern religion of reincarnation, that our bodies go into the ground or are cremated, but our souls come back in a different life form, normally an animal, depending on your karma and the good and bad and how they measure up. Others buy into something called universalism, which is the idea that maybe there is an afterlife of some kind of heaven or paradise, and pretty much everyone goes there unless you're an Adolf Hitler kind of person. And then, of course, there's the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, which is this place where most people end up. The super bad people go to hell, the super saints go to heaven, and the rest of us end up in this place called purgatory, where we'll get to heaven eventually, but we need to suffer and pay for our sins for a while. But the Bible doesn't really teach any of those. The biblical teaching actually cuts right across all of those philosophies. Here's what the Bible teaches about what happens after I die. For a Christian, death is simply a departure to be with Jesus in heaven. And this is the key idea that I want to explore together for the next couple of minutes. For a Christian, death is simply a departure to be with Jesus in heaven. And I want to take each of these three lines of this big idea and just tease them out a little bit to think about what happens the moment after I die. The first thing I want to explore is this middle line. What is death? Well, death, according to the Bible, is simply this departure from this life. I want us to look at primarily some words that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church in a place called Philippi. We call it the letter to the Philippians. And in Philippians chapter 1, here's what Paul writes. He says, I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage, so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul is in Rome, he's in prison, he's awaiting trial, and he's saying, I want to honor Jesus, but bottom line, there's only two outcomes. I'll either be acquitted and be set free and continue my life, or I'll be guilty and I will die. And he says, either way, I just want to glorify Jesus. And then he goes on talking about these two possible outcomes. He says, for me, to live is Christ, and to die, well, that's gain. If I'm to go on living in this body, that'll mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. He's saying, if the choice was to me, and it wasn't, it was up to the Emperor Nero, but he says, man, if it was over to me and I got the option to choose between these two options, life, living for Jesus and honoring him, or death, I actually don't know which one I'd choose, he says. And this is why. He says, I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it's more necessary for you that I remain in the body. And in these verses, there's this brilliant little metaphor or image that he uses. Here it is here. He says, my desire is to depart and be with Christ. That word we translate depart is very rare. It's used 3 times in our New Testament. But it's used outside of the New Testament in some fascinating ways. It's used to describe a soldier or a traveller who packs up their tent and everything in their backpack and heads off to the next place. Or it's used of a ship weighing anchor, ready to set sail to a new harbour. And so Paul uses this image of packing up, of weighing anchor, and of heading off to a new destination. He uses this to describe what happens when we die. He in fact uses the word again in his last letter, his final words when he's back in Rome 5 or 6 years later, and this time he is going to die. And he writes in 2 Timothy 4, his final words. He says, Timothy, I'm already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I've fought the good fight. I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. He says, it's time. I'm weighing anchor, and I'm leaving. I'm leaving this life, and I'm departing to be with Jesus. This idea of death as a departure from this life has been brilliantly captured by a TV ad in the last few years. It's a life insurance company called Partners Life. And you might have seen this ad on TV. This guy ends up in this big departure lounge. He has to take a number and he goes to take a seat between these two guys. There's a naked dude a little further along. There's a woman choking on an apricot opposite him. And he suddenly realizes as he's sitting there reflecting on the fact he's died that he left the gate open. And then all of a sudden his dog comes trotting up to him. But in this ad, it's captured something quite brilliantly about death. The way that the Bible describes death, the way Paul talks about it in Philippians 1. Death is a departure from this life. And so they've really understood that in putting this ad together. What they've got wrong, however, is what happens to this guy. Because sure, they picture it as a departure, but they picture it as him sitting in a departure lounge in an endless queue, waiting to find out where he's going next. That's not the way that Paul would describe death. Paul instead here argues in Philippians 1 that I desire to depart and be with Christ. That's what he says. So for Paul, it's not a departure to a departure lounge where you have to sit in an endless queue and wait. It's not weighing anchor and setting sail with no idea where the next harbour's going to be. Instead, it's leaving this life to be with Jesus. That's what he said. It's a departure to be with Christ. And in the way that verse 23 of Philippians 1 is written in the original language, it's actually very precise the way the language works. The word depart and the word be go together grammatically. In other words, it is both a departure and an arrival. You can't depart this life without the fact that you will immediately then be with Jesus. And so for Paul, death is a departure from this life, but it's a departure to somewhere else, to life with Jesus in heaven. He will explain that more in another of his letters, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, therefore we always are confident and know, as long as we're at home in the body, we're away from the Lord, for we live by faith and not by sight. He's saying as long as we're in this life, we're in this body, and it means we're away from Jesus and we can't see him, we're living by faith. But that changes when we die. He says in verse 8, we're confident, I say, we would prefer to be away from this body and at home with the Lord. And what Paul is describing here is this: what happens when we die. It's what theologians call the intermediate state. And the idea is that when we die, our body is buried or it's cremated. It actually doesn't matter. God's going to take care of it either way. And so our bodies are asleep in death, but our souls immediately go to be with Jesus in heaven. And the biblical hope is that when we depart this life, if we're Christians, our souls are immediately, consciously in the presence of Jesus. And it's a temporary state, that's why they call it the intermediate state, until the resurrection. When Jesus returns to this world to set up his eternal kingdom, he will raise all of our bodies back to life. Whether they've been cremated, buried, decomposed, it doesn't matter. The God of creation is going to pull them back together, and this body is going to become incorruptible and imperishable. These beautiful words that Paul writes elsewhere. And this is our hope. But in the meantime, between death and that future resurrection, we're in this intermediate state where our bodies are in the ground or cremated, but our souls are with Jesus in heaven. After the resurrection comes what we call the eternal state. And that's what I want to talk about next week and zero in on exactly what that's going to be. But this is our hope, that our souls, when we die, immediately and consciously are in the presence of Jesus. And we open our eyes in heaven, and we're now with Christ forever. And look again how Paul describes us in Philippians. He says, to die, it's gain. He says, I desire to depart and be with Jesus. He says, it's better by far. And what Paul is saying is that we live in this fallen world that's broken because of our sin. And I am looking forward, he says, to that place, to being with Jesus in heaven. That's better than this futile life, this hevel life that we've been looking at in Ecclesiastes. Our problem is that we don't necessarily agree with Paul. We actually don't necessarily think about heaven this way. For many of us, if we were given this choice that Paul is talking about in Philippians 1, we'd probably choose life here on earth. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think there's a couple of key ones. One is we don't understand what heaven's going to be like. And we're certainly not sure what that eternal state will be like. And that's why I want to explore that together next week. But the other reason is I think we've bought into a lie from our culture and society around us. This is the lie. YOLO. You only live once. It's this philosophy that's bandied around in our world today that's all about enjoying life and getting stuck in and sucking the marrow out of life. And I'm all for sucking the marrow and enjoying life. But YOLO, you only live once, that's a lie. That is completely false. The truth of the matter is that we live this life here on earth. And then if we're Christians, we depart to be with Jesus in heaven, which Paul says is even better. And then after the resurrection of the dead, we then live in the new heavens and the new earth, which we're going to look at next week. And I'm telling you, that's even better again. And so this idea that this life is all there is, that we've got to get everything out of this life, that actually isn't true for Christians. And that's why previous generations of Christians talked much more and sung more and looked forward so much more to heaven than I think we do. The great 19th century evangelist D.L. Moody said these words a little bit before he died. He said, soon you'll read in the newspaper that I'm dead. Don't believe it for a moment. I will be more alive than ever before. Folks, this is our hope if we're Christians. If we've put our faith in Jesus, death is simply a departure to be with Jesus in heaven. So we've looked at what death is in the second line, and we've talked a little bit about this third line, where we go when we depart. We go to be with Jesus in heaven. But as we finish up, I just want to touch on this top line. Who does this actually apply to? And the Bible is very clear that this is the hope specifically for Christians. And so this is going after that idea of universalism that many people in our world hold today. There's an assumption out there that if there's an afterlife, if there's a heaven, well, I'm not perfect, but I'll probably be okay. And you see this assumption in lots of different places. The area I notice it most is when prominent New Zealanders have died through the years. And what happens is they'll often draw cartoons about this particular well-known Kiwi that's passed away. And this is what the cartoons look like. Here's a few of them from the last 20 years. This is Possum Bourne, the great rally driver who died almost 20 years ago now. And the cartoon is this, handbrakey through the pearly gates and into heaven. Or when Martin Crowe, one of our greatest cricketers, passed away. This was the cartoon that came out as St. Peter directs him on to the cricket grounds of heaven. Or when, of course, the great rugby player John Lomu died. This is the cartoon that was displayed. And I'm not trying to make any comment about these three gentlemen and whether or not they're in heaven, because I don't know. That's between God and them. I have no idea about the state of their souls. What I'm pushing into is this assumption that these cartoons show us, that for many people in New Zealand, even today, as we move into a post-Christian world, there's still this assumption, if there's a heaven, if there's an afterlife, well, we'll probably all be there, won't we? Because we're good people. I've got a lovely, tiny little book in my library by American pastor Andy Stanley. It's called How Good is Good Enough? And he goes after this idea. Here's what he writes in the book. He says, good people go to heaven. Now, he doesn't believe that. He's exploring the idea. But he says, good people go to heaven. The logic flows something like this. There's a good God who lives in a good place reserved for good people. The criterion for making it to this good place is to be good. And then he asks this question. But how good is good enough? Like, what's the criteria? What's the standard? Where's the checklist that you have to fill in to know that you're good enough to get in? How do you know where the bar is set? And the problem in our world is that many people make the assumption, if there's a heaven, if there's an afterlife, well, I'm probably good enough. And Andy Stanley says, how do you know? How good is good enough? Because that's a huge problem if you can't be sure that you're actually going to make it. But there's an even bigger problem to this than that. And the problem is, what if this idea is completely wrong? What if good people don't go to heaven? You see, I don't think Jesus believed that. Here's what Jesus says in his famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. I tell you that unless your righteousness, your goodness, surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this doesn't have the impact on us as it would have had on his original audience. But the Pharisees and teachers of the law he's talking about, they were the super good guys. They were the professional good people in their world. And what Jesus is saying is your goodness would need to surpass theirs to get into heaven. His original audience would have gasped at this, because if those guys weren't going to make it into the kingdom of heaven, there was no hope for the rest of us. In other words, Jesus has just ramped the bar up very high. And then he says this at the end of the chapter. So be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. In other words, Jesus sets the standard at perfection. Jesus puts the bar at 100% and says if you want to get into a perfect heaven with a perfectly holy God, you have to be perfect. Good people don't go to heaven according to Jesus. Perfect people go to heaven. And Jesus is the only perfect person who's ever lived. So the rest of us are in serious trouble. So Andy Stanley summarizes this way. Romans chapter 3. I forgot this passage from the Apostle Paul. He writes, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. There's no one who does good, not even one. Now, Paul isn't saying there's no one who ever does anything good. He's saying there is no one who is consistently and perfectly good. He summarizes at the end, for all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so, Andy Stanley says, the reason good people don't go to heaven is that there aren't any good people. There are only sinners. That's the bad news that the Bible consistently teaches. But here's the good news. Good people don't go to heaven, but forgiven people do. And that is what the message of the Bible is all about. That's the good news that the Bible teaches. That is why Jesus came. That is why Jesus died on the cross, to pay for our sins and what we've done wrong. That's why Jesus rose from the dead, to conquer death once and for all and defeat it so that he could offer forgiveness and eternal life for those of us who choose to accept his forgiveness and who trust him that he will get us into heaven. That's what it means to be a Christian. And if you're watching this today and maybe the penny's dropped for you for the very first time, or you're just beginning to explore what a relationship with Jesus might look like, this is what I want you to understand. That there is an afterlife, there is a heaven, but it's only forgiven people that get there. Because we're all sinners and we're all broken, and we can't fix that by our good deeds. It's a matter of trusting in Jesus and admitting our need for him. And if you've never taken that step, you can do that right now. In fact, we have a team standing by right now who would love to engage with you and talk with you about that. You can just click the button as you're watching this, and they would love to talk with you more about what it means to acknowledge your sin and to put your faith in Jesus as the one who died for our sins and rose again. See, it's for a Christian that this is our hope, that death is simply this departure to be with him in heaven forever. So as we finish, so what? What impact does this hope have in our lives today? And as we wrap it up, I want to just quickly walk through 4 implications of this reality. If this is what death is, it's simply this weighing anchor and heading off and departing to go to heaven to be with Jesus forever because we've been forgiven. How does that impact our life today? Let me suggest 4 things really quick as we finish. Number 1, we can face death with joy. We can face death with joy. Now, it may be, particularly if you're a teenager or young adult, you may feel like death is ages away and you don't have to worry about it. But those 3 precious girls in 2008 are a reminder death is coming for all of us, and there is no certainty about when we will die. And the fact of the matter is we live in a world where people try and ignore death and not talk about it and not think about it. Because there's a fear around death that hovers over humanity. But if you're a Christian, then you can approach death with joy, and so can I. We can say with Paul, it's better by far to go be with Jesus. It doesn't mean we want the pain that comes with dying. It doesn't mean we may not grieve what we may miss out on with people we love. But folks, if this is the Christian hope, we face death with joy. It also means that we can grieve for others with hope. When people that we love, spouses, parents, kids, friends, when they die, if they've trusted in Jesus, we grieve with hope. Paul will write in 1 Thessalonians 4, brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who have fallen asleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. Notice that Paul and his colleagues are saying, we don't want you to grieve like the rest of mankind. Now, Paul is not saying, I don't want you to grieve. Grieving is a good thing for us to do. Death is our enemy, and death separates us from the people we love. So we should grieve and mourn and lament. In the book of Acts, when Stephen, the first martyr, dies, it says some friends come and they bury him and they mourned deeply for him. We should grieve and we should weep when we lose people that we love. But if they are believers, we have this hope, which the certainty that they're in heaven with Jesus. So we grieve, but our grief is tinged with hope. Thirdly, third implication is that we can live now with perspective. When we understand that to die is simply to depart and go be with Jesus in heaven, it changes how we live. Earlier in the year, we did this series called He Said What, looking at some of the tough sayings of Jesus. And in a message I did about what Jesus taught about money, I talked about this idea from author Randy Alcorn about living for the dot or the line. The line is like this timeline that goes forever and ever of eternity. And Randy Alcorn says, in light of eternity, this life, the whole life we live now on earth, is this tiny blip, this dot on the line. And we get so focused on the dot. And yet the Bible calls us to live this life in light of the line of eternity. And what I've found is that the more we understand this key biblical idea, that for a Christian, death is simply a departure to be with Jesus in heaven, the more we begin to live for heaven now. It was one of the beautiful things about these three families who lost their daughters. It changed their perspective on life and decisions and spending and time management and forgiveness, because the more we understand that really the real life is still to come, it changes how we live today. So if we really believe in this hope, it means we face death with joy, and we grieve for others with hope, and we live now with perspective. And finally, I think it means we can share Christ with passion. Because folks, this is great news. And this is the good news we have to share with others. One of the most beautiful memories of my life was sharing this message with a woman named Nairi. Nairi had terminal cancer. Her daughter came to our church, and with her mum dying, she asked her mum to come and do a course that we ran called Explore, pretty much like Alpha. It was a chance to explore the Christian life, and Nairi did the course and enjoyed it. But at the end, she wasn't ready to make a decision to trust in Jesus. But her health was going downhill fast. And so her daughter asked her mum, if I asked Brad, would you be willing for him to come and talk to you? And she said, yeah. And so she called me up, and I went round to Nairi's home. Nairi was by this time fading pretty fast. And I went into her bedroom, and she was lying in her bed, and her daughter was lying on the bed with her, and I knelt down next to her, and I held her hand and asked how she was doing. And then I said, Nairi, did you understand what was talked about at Explore? Did you have any questions? And she said, no. And I just ran through again the good news about Jesus and this life he offers us freely by grace. And then I said, Nairi, is there any reason why you can't trust in Jesus right now? And her eyes welled up with tears. And she said, yeah, there's one reason. And she shared with me one thing in her life that had happened years and years before, that she felt like God wasn't able to forgive, and that would stop her going to heaven. And I swore to her I would never tell anyone, and I'm not going to tell you what that was. But I knelt there next to her bed, and I said, Nairi, do you trust me when I tell you what the Bible teaches? And she said, yeah. And I said, Nairi, when Jesus died for the sins of the world, he died for that sin. He's already taken care of that. He's already paid the penalty. You don't need to let that stop you trusting in him. Would you give that to him? Would you trust him with that? Would you like to give your life to him? And she said, yeah. And I had the privilege of leading her in this prayer to trust in Christ. I was planning to go back and visit her 2 days later, but I got a call from her daughter. Nairi had weighed anchor, and she had departed this life to be with Jesus in heaven, and that's where she is now. And when my time comes, when it's my time to weigh anchor, I am absolutely certain I'm going to see Nairi again. I'm going to embrace Natasha again. I'm going to talk with Hannah again. I'm going to meet Amy Grace properly for the very first time. Because folks, this is our hope, that death is simply a departure to be with Jesus in heaven. Let's believe this. Let's live for this. And let's share this incredible message. God bless.